Great. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Welcome to our third Panoramas Roundtable of the spring semester. I'm Kaylin. I am the Panoramas coordinator for this academic year. For those of you who don't know, Panoramas is an online student-led publication dedicated to the news, research, culture, and art of Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latinx and Caribbean diasporas. This semester, we're going to be hosting a roundtable discussion every week. And we have a great team of interns and students working together to make this possible. For those of you who want the MyPit OCC credit or MyPit Global credit, you can get a scan of this QR code here pulled up on the screen. So today, Peyton and Bridget, two of our newest interns, will be speaking about disability and mental health resources in Chile. While the students are presenting and during the discussion, please use the chat feature for any comments or reactions. And we encourage you to use the raise hand feature that you can find under the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then we do have this live transcription going. And if you want to remove, you can click and drag it if it's like in the way of anything. And if you want to remove it, there's a way of doing that too. I believe you just click on the button at the bottom of the screen that says live transcription. So Peyton and Bridget, you want to take it away?
Thank you, Kaylin.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you guys all for coming out today. Bridget and I are super excited to start talking about our articles that we wrote this week and to really start engaging in a really comprehensive discussion as we move through this presentation. So today we'll be talking about disability and mental illness in Latin America. And specifically, we're going to explore access to resources for both of these in Chile, which is a country in South America. So before we get started, this is open to anybody who wants to participate. So what is a disability? What are mental disorders? What are mental illnesses? If you have any examples of them, or what do those mean to you?
And feel free to just type in the chat or raise your hand. Depression and anxiety, two very common examples of mental disorders. Autism, very good example. Learning disabilities and disorders. A mental condition that impedes daily tasks, awesome. Very true. Disability can be both visible and not so visible. Limits person's movements, senses, and activities. OCD, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, or post-traumatic disorder. Okay, I think these are some awesome examples. Thank you guys for responding.
Yeah, those are all really good.
So if we consider some definitions, a disability is often defined as any condition of the body or mind that makes it difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and to interact with the world around them. And if we consider the definition for mental disorder, this can be a wide range of conditions which may affect mood, thinking, feeling, or behavior. Mental disorders can be both occasional and they can be chronic. They may affect the individual's ability to relate to others and perform daily activities. So you guys hit the nail on the head. Those are all perfect examples and perfect definitions. What we can also tell from these two definitions is that these two entities are not unique from one another. They play into each other. And while mental disorders are not always so debilitating, they certainly can be. Severe and chronic cases certainly can be considered a psychiatric disability. One of the things I saw in the chat that I really liked is that some disabilities, while you can see them right away, others are very non-communicable. So I'll come back to talking about mental illness a little bit later, but right now I'm going to give it away to Peyton to talk about disability in Chile.
All right, thank you, Bridget. So as we kind of talked about in the chat, there's a bunch of different ways that everybody can perceive disabilities and can perceive mental illnesses. in the world right now, there's over 1 billion people who have a disability. That's 1 in 8 people. So it's super prevalent. And unfortunately, this conversation doesn't come up enough. So people can feel uncomfortable talking about disabilities and mental illnesses, which is part of the problem. However, if we can foster a really comfortable environment to talk about what disabilities are, what people with disabilities look like, and how we can kind of help increase awareness for disabilities, we can foster a safer environment for the future, and we can help eliminate stigmas about these two really important ideas. So why write about it? So personally for me, this topic is super close to my heart. Over the past few years, I've done some pretty intense, interactions and research with disabilities as well as special needs. Here in Pittsburgh, I work at the Children's Institute, which is a school for children with special needs. And over the summer, I work at a summer camp for kids with special needs. In addition to this, at the university, I've been involved in a research lab where we looked at mature neuron counts for people with autism, and we compared it to neurotypical brains. So kind of seeing both like the humanitarian as well as scientific sides, it's one of the most fascinating things you can really ever learn about. And by kind of gaining more information, it's my pleasure today to you to kind of help spread this information, as I'm sure Bridget would attest to as well. So before we really get into discussion, there's a few things that we should kind of talk about, specifically vernacular-wise. So there's differences in the words that we use. So for example, disabled person versus person with disabilities. Which one is correct? We're going to go with the latter, person with disabilities, because just like anybody else, we're all people first, and we should be defined by the individual that we present ourselves as and not the disability that we may have. A second thing that we want to really emphasize the difference between is normal versus typical. So a lot of times you'll hear normal when we should be using typical, because frankly, none of us are normal. We're all very weird, different individuals, and that's key here. So we want to use typical when referring to environments as we go through this discussion today. So what's going on in Latin America in terms of disability and disability resources? So only between 20 and 30% of children with disabilities have access to education in Latin America. In addition to this, between 80 and 90% of people with disabilities are unemployed, and those who have jobs are typically underpaid or receive no monetary compensation at all. These two things we'll get into in a little bit. And finally, less than 20% of people with disabilities in the region have Social Security. So these numbers are really astonishing, like quite low compared to what you maybe would expect. So hopefully, through discussion today, we can kind of formulate ideas and new ways to think about what disabilities are and how we can provide more resources to this population and this cohort. So again, today we're going to take a closer look on Chile, which is a country in South America, because it is a leader in activism and inclusion, especially considering the resources that it provides for its population with disabilities, as well as mental health resources, as Bridget will talk about. So starting with the workforce in Chile, although 7.6% of Chile's population has a disability, employees with disability only make up about 0.5% of the workforce. So 1 in 14 people having a disability in Chile. Meanwhile, in the labor force, we see 1 in 200. So there's a huge discrepancy here, and we'll talk about why that is. And actually, these numbers are from 2013. In more recent statistics, it shows that upwards of 15% of Chile's population has a disability. So what's the problem? So the problem is stigma, kind of as we talked about. Typically, when you don't understand something, stigmas arise because you may not go out of your way to find out more about what that problem is. And through this, this process of stigmatization, we lead to this spreading of misinformation. Chile, however, is doing a lot to kind of get rid of these stigmas and focus on how we can incorporate more workers with disabilities into the workforce. So primarily, there's a lot of positive images of inclusion for companies who hire workers with disabilities. So compared to companies who are less inclusive, less diverse, the public tends to favor companies that have workers with disabilities on their workforce. In addition to this, changing perspective towards a more positive inclusion, we also see a lot of changes to Chile's labor codes. So with companies with more than 100 people, they're required to have designated members on their human resources team with expertise on employees with disabilities. But why is this important? Well, if you have somebody who's an expert on working with employees with disabilities, this can open up a safe line of communication for those employees and also just provide more resources in general for the employees as well as the entire staff. In addition to this, annual office trainings are required for every company to kind of alleviate the stress of being a worker with disabilities, perhaps in a typical work environment. In addition, this spreads knowledge about what it means to be a worker with disabilities or work with somebody who has disabilities. So these are all really promising things that Chile is doing to foster more inclusive environments in their workforces. Finally, one really fantastic thing that Chile has begun to do over the past 10 years is the Descúbreme Foundation. So Descúbreme stands for Discover Me, and it started in 2010, in Chile. And what it does is it takes young Chilean workers or Chilean students, and it helps to incorporate them into the workforce by giving them opportunities in vocational schools, as well as apprenticeships, and even forms of higher education. So this is a really awesome foundation that's been started in Chile, and since then has spread to at least 5 countries in South America. So Chile is clearly a leader in terms of workforce inclusion and diversity for this population. So let's discuss a few things. Was any of this information surprising to you? And then, having worked in the United States, which I'm sure all of us have, what have been some of your experiences with workers with disabilities? Yeah, Manuel, if you'd like to talk.
Hey, Peyton. I'm so glad that you guys brought this up. That it's really a topic that's not very often discussed in the context of Latin America. Well, actually, in any context, no matter what country we're in, right? But in Latin America, as in so many countries in the developing world, we have issues that are, that go well beyond what happens in developed countries. And so, Chile is a fantastic example. It's a leader, as you said. But when you compare what happens in Chile with what happens in this instance, I can say normally, in terms of the distribution of what happens in just about every other country in Latin America, is a very different story, right? And you can see how that impacts family and domestic economies. How you can see the way in which those impacts, are not really a natural undertaking by states. They really fall under the responsibility of family and the people who are legally connected to people with disabilities, especially those who have disabilities that do not make it so easy for them to integrate into the workforce or the economic environment of a particular country. And so I think it's really important to also keep in mind that Chile is fantastic, but it's head and shoulders above most of the other countries in Latin America.
Thank you, Manuel. That's a really good point. And that's why looking at Chile and seeing the resources that they provide for people can be really beneficial if we look at the bigger picture of Latin America and seeing how we can take, the programs that Chile offers and kind of apply it to these other countries. Thank you.
And you also have some things in the chat here. Matt Robinson said, "I'm surprised that such a large number of workers with disabilities are underpaid or receive no compensation." A similar comment from Mary, "Very surprised at the statistics. It's hard to imagine that they are so far behind us, and I don't think we are as advanced as we should be." I think that's a really good point to put out there, that this is a phenomenon that is affecting so many countries. It's something that's not talked about in so many countries. But yeah, I'll let you continue reading those in the chat if you would like.
Can I access the chat?
If not, I can keep reading.
Yeah, can you keep reading?
Yes. Okay. Megan said, "I really appreciated the discussion about hiring HR reps who are trained to serve individuals with disabilities. I have not considered this perspective until reading your article, and it's such an important point."
All great points. Thank you.
Noah also said, "Having a brother with a mental disorder, the process of getting a job requires a lot more steps than the typical job application process."
Very true. And, I think as we look between parallels of the United States and Chile, oftentimes employers, when they see that, a possible employee has a disability, because of the stigmas that arise from it, they're less likely to hire them when in fact, typically they're just as capable and can do a fantastic job in the same environment. Is there any more?
That's all we have right now. Go ahead.
All right, well, thank you guys for participating in this part of the discussion. Those were all really awesome. So next we're going to start talking about inclusive education and what it means and what inclusive education means in Chile. So what is inclusive education? It's a new reform kind of program that is working on incorporating students with special needs into typical classroom settings, and this idea of the least restrictive environment. So for the past few decades, it was always assumed that, putting students who had special needs into private classrooms or even private facilities to a certain extent was a better method than trying to integrate them into typical classrooms because of, possible, students making fun of other students or, problems with the curriculum. However, as we're seeing with research and development over on this topic, integrating students with special needs into their least restrictive environment has a lot of benefits for not just the student, but the classroom as a whole. Incorporating these students who are able to perform and learn in a typical classroom with their other peers can build confidence. It can also foster these conversations, these really tough conversations that we're having now at a much earlier age, which can help eliminate stigmas in the future. In addition, we can kind of work on transforming curriculums as a whole between special needs curriculums as well as typical classroom curriculums, eventually, fostering better reform in education moving forward. Nonetheless, schools for students with special needs are still important because, again, disability and special needs is quite a spectrum and can affect a lot of students differently. So sometimes these supplementary resources are still important. So in Chile, implementation of inclusive education has been going on for upwards of 25 years, which is incredible compared to a lot of the efforts made, just globally with inclusive education. So from one study in 1997, where 3,300 students were included in typical classroom settings, there was an 850% growth rate over just 8 years until 2005 when they measured again, and this was upwards of 30,000 people, 30,000 students included in typical classroom settings. So along with this came 330% growth rates in subsidies for special education. So this is still back in the early 2000s when Chile was making all these reforms and pushing towards more resources for disabilities and students with special education. In addition to this, over 20,000 teachers were trained in how to be more inclusive in their educational process. So again, just looking at all these efforts that Chile is making and has been making for decades is super important when we consider what resources we're providing for our students with disabilities. So again, a similar discussion can kind of arise. Drawing parallels to US education, what similarities can you find between special education and providing disability resources for students in Chile and the United States? And what about differences as well?
Hello. So I'm in education right now, and drawing the parallels, the least restrictive environment is a great topic to talk about because that's very big in the US as well. It's a big thing, and it is a very challenging thing. And right now it's even more challenging. I did an observation actually last week in an intensive learning classroom, and the teacher in the classroom talked to me specifically about how she implements those students into the classroom to give them the least restrictive environment. And sometimes the student, they may want to be as much in the classroom as the teacher wants them to be, but sometimes there are things holding them back. So it's still a struggle to find a way to get to that least restrictive environment when sometimes a disability may be so severe that they just can't do it regardless of how bad they might want to be or the teacher might want them to be. But that is an excellent point to bring up because it is a very beneficial thing to have.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it can be tough sometimes, but it really just takes a group effort wanting to learn about this and wanting to implement this least restrictive environment in order to see really good change with these education policies. Thank you, Hunter. Is there anything in the chat?
Nothing in the chat. I think you're good to go.
All right, guys. So kind of closing this discussion on...
Oh, wait, sorry, Peyton. We've got some comments.
All right, it's all right. We'll go back.
In the US, there is integration within public schools, yet I do not think that there is as much as there could be. There are clubs such as Best Buddies as well, but I think there could be more done to include students with disabilities.
I agree.
We also have, I think there is a lot of barriers with getting educators trained properly to deal with a large variety of issues. I think that's a really good point as well, because like the comment of Hunter as well, there is just such a wide range of what a disability can be and what a disability can look like, and the severity of it, that it is hard to, training professionals is a whole nother challenge of how can we prepare this workforce to deal with a myriad of different situations. Sorry, go ahead, Ashley.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I was going to say, I worked as a teacher for a daycare, I think 2 summers ago, but it is really interesting to see like the disparities between people who have gotten training. I know I didn't have any training, but I mean, I was handling kids differently, especially with the ones that had disabilities. There was one child who had like both cerebral palsy and autism, and so he needed a lot of help, but there wasn't the right training given to like take care of him half the time. And so it really does fall onto like the like caretakers themselves to educate themselves if like the right treatment and like, care can be given. Because I know I was researching, I was trying to be the best that I could. I was in there. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how much education can change, and trainings can like change the difference or make a difference. But yeah, thank you.
That was an awesome point. All right, no, thank you for the discussion there. That was awesome. So the final thing we're going to talk about is public policy in terms of access to resources for people with disabilities in Chile. A huge one is healthcare. So Bridget is going to really take the reins a little bit later and talk about what the healthcare system looks like in Chile and the discrepancies that arise there. So just to keep it short real quick, Chile operates under a public and private healthcare system. So public being available to everybody in the general public, typically paid for through taxes. And there's also a private healthcare, which offers usually specialized care, has maybe perhaps better techniques as well, but is usually much more expensive. And what the problem is that people with disabilities, they typically have to turn towards private healthcare in order to get the treatment and the resources that they need. However, this treatment is extremely expensive. So actually in 2019, there was a bunch of protests all throughout Chile, but one especially in Santiago about people with disabilities, activists for people with disabilities fighting for, kind of reforms to this healthcare system, as well as, higher pension pays in addition to that. This picture is of Maria Guerra, who was one of the protesters in the Santiago protest. She has a disability in addition to 2 of her children having disabilities as well. And she describes it as debt, illness. It is a constant cycle. So this is a problem that we see throughout all countries, going for this specialized care can be really intense sometimes. And not only are these families and these people dealing with their disabilities, but now they're also incurring more debt because of the disabilities they have and the specialized treatment that they require. Nonetheless, there is a brighter future for Chile in terms of access to disability resources. So in 2010, the Standards on Equal Opportunities and Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities was enacted, which kind of gives more resources to people with disabilities, fights for representation, fights for inclusion, ushers in more conversations about what it means to have disabilities and mental health and things like that. In addition, since these protests has been a recognition of sign language, deaf culture, and resources for the blind. So we've seen an increase in output for books that are now printed in Braille, which is super cool because this now gives out more information to people who may be blind. And finally, probably the biggest thing is the creation of El Servicio Nacional de Discapacidad, so the disability service, the National Service for Disabilities. So Chile was actually the first country in South America to enact this department. And as it kind of sounds, it has a host of resources for people with disabilities, offers opportunities, helps eliminate stigmas, and all those other wonderful things that come with specialized departments for people with disabilities. So what does this lead to in the future, and how we can use Chile as an example is that it opens up more discussions, similar to the one we're having today. It also ushers in more representation for these people, and then in the long run, more resources. So that's what we kind of look at. We're looking at access to resources for disabilities in Chile. And with that being said, it is now Bridget's turn to take over.
Thank you, Peyton. And this one last comment that you had in the chat as well, I think sums it up quite nicely. Oh, and we have another comment. But just that Chile's actions towards improving resources for students with special needs, hopefully that will start a wave throughout Latin America, which I think in many cases can be the hope. And I think in the future, other countries can look at Chile as a model for these types of reforms. Manuel said, it is important to visualize people with disabilities as part of a community and not necessarily as economic engines within the cogs of a workforce painted with the same brush. Seeing it that way allows for the policies to support individuals and families without expecting profit generating activity from them. Very good point. Okay, if there are any more questions or comments about disability and their forms that have been made, please hold on to them, because we will definitely have some time at the end for some more general connection and trying to draw some common things between what Peyton is talking about and what I am about to talk about. So I want to narrow our focus a little bit to talk about mental illness in Chile, similarly with access to resources, and delve into this stigma that we've been talking about. And so before I continue, I want to give a bit of a content warning. This discussion talks a lot about depression, about mental health stigma, and I do have some personal accounts of discrimination in some healthcare settings. So I want that to be something that everyone is aware of from the forefront. I want everyone to be comfortable with this discussion, but I also wanted to include these things because, like Peyton said, it's a very important conversation to have. And so before we continue talking about stigma as well, I wanted to do some defining, because I think this is a word that we hear a lot and we don't often hear what it really means. So I think of stigma as influencing both prejudice and discrimination. So it's influencing both our attitudes and our behaviors towards a marginalized group. So social stigma can be any disapproval of someone based on tangible characteristics that set them apart from your typical member of society. I also wanted to emphasize that mental health, as we've talked about, the same with disability, is certainly, the stigma is certainly not unique to Chile. We chose Chile as a case study, and I specifically wanted to talk about mental health in Chile because I want to try and investigate and find answers for why there may be very high rates of a diagnosis of mental disorders alongside low rates of consultation. Another huge point is that mental health stigma is certainly not unique to Latin America. I mean, in a country like the US, mental illness is still heavily stigmatized. The world is moving in the right direction, I think, on this front, but we still don't fully understand, and the general population is still not fully educated about more rare disorders and severe disorders. So it's definitely something that is a worldwide phenomenon. So I want to start this off by talking about depression, because it is the leading cause of disability worldwide. And if we consider that 264 million people in the world have a depression diagnosis, there's about 7.8 billion people in the world, we can think of depression as having close to a 3.4 global prevalence. But if we look specifically at Chile, 21.7% of the population has a depression diagnosis, and 17% of Chileans have experienced symptoms. So these numbers are disproportionate, and the disease burden is clearly not allocated evenly across the world. But if we consider mental disorders more generally, approximately 1/3 of the Chilean population has a lifetime psychiatric disorder. So this just means that the disorder is going to persist throughout the individual's life. It's going to be chronic. But what I really want to focus on here today is that over 60% of Chileans diagnosed with a mental disorder do not seek out or receive treatment. And I'm purposely saying seek out or receive here because I think that this is a concept that statistics cannot necessarily grasp. I think the number is likely a combination, but I just want to make the distinction that while some people just refuse to get help or refuse to seek out treatment, others are denied treatment and others don't know ways to access it. So why are the rates of consultation for mental illness in Chile so low? I want to look at this with three possibilities. They're not the only possibilities and they're all viable possibilities, but I want to talk about the workforce and compare this to other countries. I want to talk about the structure of the health insurance system, and I also want to look at stigma. So when we consider the workforce, we can dissect this a little bit by talking about psychiatry first. And so the main thing that puts psychiatrists apart from other mental health professionals is that psychiatrists are doctors and they can prescribe medicine for mental illness when it is necessary. And I chose these countries to compare to Chile very intentionally. I chose the United States so we could have a perspective of what things are like here, where we are currently. And I chose Argentina because they do not fit the typical pattern of a Latin American country when it comes to mental health care, especially in urban centers like Buenos Aires. There's been a long history of therapy as the norm, a use of psychoanalysis, and it's something that's very much embedded in the culture. So just looking at psychiatry, the numbers and the differences are not very drastic. Per 100,000 people of the population in Chile, there's about 7 psychiatrists. In the United States, there's about 10. And in Argentina, there's about 17. So, but here's where I see the greatest deficit for mental health workers in Chile. This number can encapsulate our psychiatrists, our psychologists, specialists, social workers, but a lot of this number is all made up of mental health counselors as well, which do a lot of the day-to-day assessment and firsthand treatment of individuals who are coming in and need immediate attention or treatment. So per 100,000 people in the population, the United States has about 271 total workers, Argentina has about 247, and Chile is just under 9. So workforce, I don't think is the only thing that is impeding people from getting the treatment that they need. I think there is also something here going on with the health insurance system. So I wanted to talk about the way that this is structured. So for the public system, these premiums are based entirely on your salary. Public sector health insurance operates primarily in public hospitals. There's on average longer wait times, and you're often going to have more variability in the quality of care that you might receive. On the other hand, the private sector, these premiums are based entirely on your health risk indicators. There's better access to technology, and you're likely going to have higher quality service. So what happens here when we have a cheaper system that is based on salary and a more expensive system with more options that is based entirely on your health risk, we get this result of segmentation. And what this means is that higher income Chileans who can afford the private premiums are going to buy into them because they're going to get more coverage for the money that they have. And what also happens is that higher health risk Chileans who on average come from a lower socioeconomic status are going to choose a public plan because these out-of-pocket costs are much cheaper and the private premiums are too expensive for the care that they need right now in the moment. And so a study was done over about a decade ago, which saw this problem of segmentation and wanted to answer, well, how is this affecting mental health care specifically? And so this study took data from the Santiago Mental Disorder Survey, and they compared these results with the insurance plan of the participants, so whether they had public, private, or no health insurance. And what they found across the board was that 20% of participants with a disorder received consultation. So regardless of insurance, there was a very low rate of people going to get treatment. But what they also found was that participants on the public insurance had the highest prevalence of mental disorders, the most severe symptoms for these disorders, and the lowest rates of seeing a professional when compared to participants on the private sector. So what this tells us is that while there have been some reforms which have encouraged the growth of the private sector, that growth has also been creating this segmentation, which can cause people with psychiatric disorders to end up with insurance that is not meeting their needs adequately, or they don't feel that consultation is a real possibility. And so lastly, I wanted to talk about stigma because stigma is one of the primary factors which keeps people with a disorder from receiving treatment. And that is just a phenomenon that occurs across the globe. And so this study that we're going to talk about is a bit more recent. They investigated stigma that was residing within healthcare centers throughout the country. And what I also like about this study is that it's a series of interviews in which the experimenters talked with both health professionals and people with severe mental disorders. So they were looking at both the workers and the patients to see how each of them perceived any prejudice or discrimination that was present within their healthcare centers. And so on my next couple slides, this is kind of what I gave a content warning about. I have some clear testimonials, both from patients and both from workers. That was them talking in their interview and saying how they felt about their experience in these healthcare centers. I'm not going to read them. I was hoping that you all could just look at them and read them. And if you have any initial reactions, anything you notice, any perceived forms of discrimination or prejudice that stood out to you, if you wanted to unmute, raise your hand, type them in the chat, that would be amazing. And I can respond afterwards and fill in some context to these situations and in these interviews. Jessica, I see your comment. Yeah, Peyton, could you go back just one slide very quickly? Definitely in this second testimonial, that is when there is a loss of self-worth and dignity. Yeah. In the second quote, it's definitely true that there is this idea that people who need help can't go get help themselves. And I think this quote in particular may answer some of our questions of why rates of consultation are so low if people are being denied when they go alone. And there's also been accounts from the same study of patients actually employing strategies to get better care. So they'll show up the next day with a parent or a guardian and they can be admitted, which again, some of this depends on the laws and the regulations of a specific healthcare center, but I definitely like your wording, Jessica, of an infantilization. That's a very good way to put it. Payne, you can go to the next one if people need more time looking at that. And I appreciate everyone taking the time to look at these and read them because I know that it's hard, but I also know that this is something that is very important to talk about, and it's something that happens around the world. Something I also stood out to me about one of the first patient testimonials is this exhibition without authorization. So not only does that make the patient feel uncomfortable, not only does it make them not want to be there and not want to receive that treatment, but it's also just a violation of their rights. And when we look at worker testimonials here, the biggest thing that stands out to me is this lack of training. So workers here are openly admitting that they were not trained to handle specific situations like this. Another thing that I think is very important to address, especially with this first testimonial, is this myth that people with mental disorders or mental illness are dangerous and violent, which is absolutely not the case. More often than not, people with mental disorders are the victims of crime and violence. So you can see how that myth is embedding itself into the workforce itself, which can only perpetuate more prejudice and discrimination. Not only is there a lack of training for teachers in the education system, there's also a lack of training for workers at hospitals. Absolutely. Okay, Peyton, you can move on. Okay. And I would be remiss if I left everyone today thinking that there are being lots of amazing advancements happening for disabilities and nothing good is being done for mental health, because that's not the case. I just really think it's important to focus on why mental health prevalence or mental illness and the prevalence of it is so high in this country and the rates of consultation are so low. But what has been done? So in 1993, the National Mental Health Program was the first mental health plan that was actually implemented. It introduced a small number of psychologists, but not many. And so in 2000, this program was revamped and they introduced more workers. But what they also did was put a strong emphasis on community-based programs. So what these programs do is basically offer an alternative to the traditional care that you would receive in a psychiatric institution. They're cost effective, and they also give patients the opportunity to meet other people in the community who may have a similar disorder or similar problems. And a lot of this can be addressed through group therapy and things like that. But what I think is one of the most impressive and the most successful reforms that has been done is this Programa Nacional de Diagnóstico y Tratamiento de la Depresión. This became a national program in 2004. Its whole goal was to revamp the screenings, referrals to specialists, diagnoses, and treatment for depression. So this is currently operating in about 500 primary care centers throughout Chile. It was institutionalized by adding more and more psychologists. So the thing with this program is that while there may not be a psychiatrist who can prescribe medicine at every single center, what most of these centers have is a sort of psychiatric liaison. So if there is a confirmed case of depression and this person needs antidepressants, they can get a referral to go get medicine, which again is not ideal, but it is definitely a step in the right directions towards getting people the treatment they need. The last thing here I wanted to mention was the Garantías Explícitas de Salud. This is not so much a reform, but it's something embedded in the healthcare, which automatically covers a specific number of diseases and disorders. And there has been progress made on this front as well, because it used to only recognize mood disorders and substance abuse. So that was about 4 or 5 mental disorders. But now it says to recognize and cover all mental disorders and neurological disorders. So there's definitely a growing recognition and growing efforts to be made to get better access and better treatment for people with mental health, which I think is a great sign. And I think that this is something that will only continue to progress further in the future. I'm going to stop talking now in our last 10 or 15 minutes. If anyone has any questions that they would like to address towards me or Peyton, we also have some questions on the next slide that are thought-provoking if anyone wants to delve into those or reply to those. Really anything you want to talk about, please feel free to join in. We really want to open up the discussion. And thank you so much for coming today and for listening to us talk. Go ahead, Benjamin.
Yeah, why do you think that the rate of depression is so much higher in Chile compared to the global percentage?
That's a very good question. I think that's a question that probably has a lot of answers. I think there's definitely, there's problems of economic inequality. There's problems of social inequality. I think something that is often comorbid with depression is that general satisfaction with maybe your way of life. So it's hard to say, and it's hard to dissect why it is so much more prevalent in Chile, because it is also so prevalent everywhere. That's a very good question. And while it is just such a common disorder, I think there are definitely things with socioeconomic status, things with discrimination, with inequality, with family. There's a myriad of factors that could play into that.
Yeah, Ian.
Kind of a similar question, I guess. It's about Argentina, though, and I know this was about Chile. I was wondering if you knew anything about why the rate of or the access to therapists was so high in Argentina compared to even the United States and especially Chile. If you know anything about that.
That's a very good question. I'm actually going to write an article about that next week. So I'll probably have more information then that I could give you. But one thing I want to emphasize about Argentina is that from what I have found and from what I do know, that higher rate of psychiatrists is not necessarily signifying equal and better access for everyone throughout the country. I think about 46% of the psychiatrists that are in Argentina reside in Buenos Aires. So a lot of it is something that is very cultural. It's like normal to talk about your therapy. Like people will in Buenos Aires will like sit down for coffee and be like, how was your session? And it's also interesting that there's a very strong use of psychoanalysis, which in a lot of countries is more considered an outdated form of therapy. And I also know that they are kind of moving away from psychoanalysis and they're incorporating cognitive behavioral therapy as well. But yeah, that was a good question, because while there is a lot of doctors there, it doesn't necessarily mean equal care for everyone. Janice?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this talk. This was super interesting and informative. I'm wondering what the general knowledge of mental health among like the general population of Chileans are. Like, do most of them recognize what mental health is and like the various like mental health disorders that they could have? And are they accepting of mental health concepts and mental health illness or mental illness?
That's a really good question. I again would answer that saying that I think it is very much of a spectrum. So I think there is a recognition for mental disorders, especially disorders like depression and anxiety that are very common. I think the recognition for disorders like those is probably very similar to the recognition for peoples and workers with disabilities. And I think people recognize those as a disability. But I think what is lacking, and it's lacking in our country as well, and countries all over the world, is really a recognition for what all types of mental disorders look like, and for what severe mental disorders also look like. Especially like in those quotes I had about stigma, those are all patients with severe mental disorders. So that's clearly a factor of mental illness in which training is maybe lacking, and understanding is lacking.
Awesome. Thank you.
I just wanted to address the third bullet point on the making connections about privilege and functioning with high quality care, and those who are denied service and refuse to seek treatment. And I just want to say from some personal experience, I just believe that those who need the services most are those who are either those people who are denied service or those who refuse to seek treatment. And when they do end up in a facility, which obviously they might not be able to afford due to insurance reasons or something of that nature, that's where they feel more dehumanized and less of a person because they're there. And maybe in some instances, it's more of a forceful situation because they couldn't go seek that treatment and therefore are being forced into it, opposed to those who come from high privilege and money and wealth and things like that and can receive the better services by more trained and experienced professionals rather than that forceful treatment.
I think that's a great point. Just the process of, even if you can receive treatment, having to go through multiple steps, having to go through a longer, more stretched out process to actually get the care that you need, while for people with the private system, they might be able to get that care right away. It can make all the difference in how you actually feel about receiving that treatment and how comfortable you are with the medical professionals that you're working with. And Manuel, I did see your comment. That is a great point and something I had not considered in my brainstorming of that article that I'm definitely going to look into. Go ahead, Manuel.
Yeah, I was thinking that, there was a question earlier about why is it that in Chile it seems that depression is more prevalent, and might really have to do with, in Chile, people are getting diagnosed more frequently, right? There might be more access to professional services where people are actually documented as having the classic, what's that book called? The diagnosis, the medically accepted diagnosis, right? And rather than going completely unrecognized and just painted and discarded as just, some wackiness or whatever people want to call it disparagingly elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. That don't understand that this is actually an illness that can be treated and that can be, approached through professional services.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And I think it's good to emphasize that 264 million people diagnosed with depression that I started off with, it's not the real number. There's plenty more people who are experiencing depression, plenty more people who haven't been able to get the treatment they need, or maybe just haven't been diagnosed. So yeah. I'm going to read Mary's comment. Is it appropriate to assume that those who have more privilege potentially have access to better and higher education, and because of that have received more education about mental disorders in general and perhaps more understanding of them, and then more willing to seek help? There's a lot to address there. I think it's tough because I think privilege and education and the money that you have all play off of each other. I think as a psychology major, as someone who wants to go into this field, I've definitely become the most educated that I have about mental health and mental illness through my higher education, and admittedly, definitely through a lot of privilege I had to go to this university and be in this setting. So I think it is something that can raise awareness and hopefully will create more discussion, which can lead to more people seeking help and seeking treatment. Sorry if I did not answer that in the way that you were phrasing the question, Mary. I'm just going to look at Liz's comment very quickly. My question is more about family support systems. For example, for people that have MS in the USA, there are options available for programs for family support system. Do you find any difference between countries and approaches in the educational field or outlet for support system? Peyton, do you want to get that one?
Yeah, sure. So it's different because a lot of times the culture of these countries can be really different. There's very different and vast across a lot of these Latin American countries. So for different families and just how they perceive what like MS is and, just the opportunities that are available, this can be a very difficult thing to talk about, especially just because of how educated people are. So although I didn't do specific research across countries for MS and stuff like that, just depending on how the country itself perceives these disabilities and mental illnesses and even disabilities to a certain extent, family support systems can obviously be greater or less. So in Chile, where we have a larger understanding and there's more proactive movements towards finding resources for these people, it's easier to find support for these families. However, if you go to a lot of Latin American countries where these resources aren't available, it can be very difficult for these families to reach out and have support from even just the government themselves. If that kind of answered your question.
Benjamin, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so I would actually like to answer the first question on this page. So in what ways are physical disabilities and mental disorders perceived differently? So I'm taking an abnormal psychology class this semester, and we've actually talked about this. So I think that with physical disabilities, it's different because, they can be measured, they can be tested upon. I can run tests and observations and say, oh, you have a broken arm, oh, you have cancer, stuff like that. Whereas for mental disorders, you can't really run a lot of tests for that. And it's more like patient reported symptoms and more subjective like that. So I think that part of the stigma lies in that you can't run certain tests like you would for physical disabilities. So we're really, looking at more patient reported symptoms. And it's definitely different because it's not as like empirical of an approach to diagnosing those.
I think that's a really good point, Ben. And just the fact that this is where stigma arises from, not being able to see or perhaps like not even understanding. And in like this day and age where we have all these resources and technology is continually improving, and we have, all these tests that we will be able to run in the future, this does help like open this discussion up and open these resources for people. But in the past, certainly, like not being able to physically see what's wrong, a lot of these, disorders, these mental illnesses were clearly overlooked. And, depression was not taken as seriously as it is today because so many people, as Bridget mentioned, are affected by depression and, anxiety and other mental disorders that, again, you can't physically see, but today we can still offer those resources too.
Manuel, is that a new raised hand?
No. I should have been tired from having it up there this time, but I didn't bring it down. Sorry.
No problem. Just checking.
I think we have time for one more question if there is one. Or final remarks. No? Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone who participated, and especially to Peyton and Bridget. Like, I just want to let everyone know, Bridget and Peyton have only had this internship for less than a month, and they are writing articles and putting this together. So like really remarkable work. So impressed, so proud. I want to encourage everyone who doesn't already to follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram to keep up to date. We're having these every week, just about every week. Next week, we're going to be hearing from Isabel about migration from Central America's Northern Triangle. And I will drop the link to register there in the chat as well. And thank you. Just keep up to date with Panoramas. Good job, Peyton and Bridget. Again, thank you again to everyone who joined us. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you, Peyton. You killed it.